Christian, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm actually fine. I'm looking forward to Christmas, getting a break, but there's also a lot of exciting stuff happening on the way to Christmas in the last 3 to 4 weeks.
No, absolutely. We've already got the tree up, so we're looking forward to it for sure. So you'll be talking about emerging risks and the future of financial institutions at Risk Minds International this year. What are the emerging risks that's on your radar right now, and why?
So I would say we have probably 3.5 things I want to point out. 3.5 because the fourth one is a usual suspect, which I typically mention. The first one I want to mention is the decoupling of the real economy, let's call it the macro environment, and the financial markets, in particular the equity markets. And clearly, the equity markets and the financial markets in general got a lot of support from central banks and governments throughout 2020. And that, I think, stabilized the situation. I think that was the right thing to do. But if once in a while that will start to fade out to a certain extent, it's uncertain at this point in time, there might be a serious wake-up call to the markets, in particular to the equity markets, and it's very likely that they will start to decline steeply. That's number one. Number two, which is, I think, becoming more and more prominent on my risk radar, is climate risk and the way we financial institutions deal with it, of course. And I think there is a lot of energy injection necessary to get this into the right place. And clearly we talk about climate risk stress testing, we talk about meeting regulatory expectations, which in some jurisdictions are still a bit vague, in others a bit more aggressive and more demanding. And I think that's something where banks all across the world get prepared for and need to inject a lot of work, investment, and also energy, I think, and resources. And clearly it's also a topic that interests us from society, because there are also expectations from society on financial institutions, for instance, what we are going to finance and what we might not want to finance, and how we help clients on a path to a green business. The third one I want to mention is an increasing polarization in society. And that's something I've not seen as intensely as in 2020, is something which is coming back in one or the other way. We saw it, in, I think, the foreplay of the US election. We saw it in people getting polarized about COVID-19 measures and actions. We see it in all kinds of different places. We see social unrest in France. We saw it in the US. We saw it in Berlin. We saw it in Hong Kong. Somewhere throughout 2020. It's everywhere. And I think it seems that various camps with various convictions get more and more radical and no longer see themselves in a position to reasonably talk about the issues with the other camp. And that's something which is concerning me. And it's something which clearly in the medium and long term also has knock-on effects on the economy, on the way, we deal with each other, and on the way financial institutions need to position themselves. And then number four, that's why I said 3.5. Number four is actually a usual suspect, because COVID-19 brought back credit market and liquidity risk on stage. And I remember that I was one of the many CROs in the last probably 5 to 8 years who said non-financial risks like compliance risks, conduct risks, these kind of things, they are currently dominating the scene. But now in 2020, we saw with this global pandemic, credit risk coming up. We saw it in the credit loss expenses of many banks. And clearly credit risk is a strong focus also of us. And the shadows of the economic lockdown will be a heavy burden on the shoulder of the economy for at least the next 2 years, in my assessment. So that is also something I want to mention. But because everybody in risk is well familiar with credit market and liquidity risk, I say we have 3.5 times instead of 4 points here.
But of course, financial risks are still important in this job. And the emerging risks are, there's a lot of non-financial risks actually that are emerging. Like you said, the polarization of society and these demographic movements, how will they impact financial institutions?
So first of all, I think you are right. When I said that primary risks are back on stage, I'm not saying that the prominent place of non-financial risks on stage has gone. And in particular, in the remote working places and the environment we had, things like conduct risk, but everything which you cover typically in compliance and non-financial or consequential risk, as we would call it, they played a prominent role, and they were also at elevated levels. Now, if you think about the impact, coming to the core of your question on social and demographic movements on financial institutions, I think there will be second order effects, just because we see on TV that there is social unrest somewhere in the suburbs of Paris that doesn't have an immediate direct impact on my portfolio, on my positions and all of that. But medium and long term, it can and maybe also will have consequences. And since banks and financial institutions in general are an integral part of society, it will clearly also impact us. And I think we try to deal with it as financial institutions. Speaking for UBS, we do a lot in corporate responsibility. I think we have the clear principle of giving back to society. And in particular in 2020, we did a lot, donations to COVID-19, facilities who helped to, let's say, mitigate the damages. We helped in the financing programs of the governments across the world. We have an established and institutionalized UBS in Society program, which helps us to actually live our responsibilities for society. We have community services. So I think banks, and that's not restricted clearly to UBS, I think a lot of banks are doing this. So we have our granted part and place in society where we try to contribute. And I should also say, luckily this time in this pandemic, banks were part of the solution in helping to finance the economy and not part of the problem like we had it in 2008, where the whole crisis was stimulated and came basically from financial institutions. So that's a good thing to have. But if I see all these social and demographic movements, which will be up the horizon, also in the demographic developments of society, having an aging population, for instance, many things you could take into account in the medium and long term, it will affect the way we do business. And it will affect the way banks and financial institutions are embedded into society.
So as we're at the end of the year, is there one key lesson that you want everybody, every risk manager to take away from this year and take it with themselves into 2021 and further?
I think that the first and most important point is maybe people forgot in the last years things went very well in the financial industry, that we need to expect the unexpected. I think that is very important. And probably everybody who is, talking about 2020, mid or fall of 2019, they had no idea what's about to come. That we have, no more travel, that we have remote working places, that we are scared about family members, relatives, and friends, all of that. So being prepared for the unexpected, and at all time being prepared for that. I think that's the first lesson. The second is, I think we need to be prepared and take appropriate action and measures to deal with a situation like we had it in 2020. And for us, that meant we always plan for contingency resources. For instance, if you have elevated levels of margin calls in structured margin lending, you need people who work on these margin calls, and you need to have, or I should say probably the other way around, as a risk manager, you should never allow for an organization which is stretched to the end so that you don't have spare resources. And I think having contingency resources in place, which you can deploy and bring in if there is all of a sudden more work, for instance, in workout or in margin calls or in dealing with clients, you need to have these resources. That's one way of being prepared. A second way of being prepared is, and UBS has this for many years, since the uncertainty at the horizon has never been bigger as at this point in time, I think the only way to get an idea what it could mean for your portfolio if certain things would materialize or happen is to have a very strong stress testing framework. And that's something we developed and deployed many years ago. And that really helped us in 2020, being able to, in a very agile way, to adapt, shocks and factors we apply as risk factors to our portfolios, to test what would happen if this pandemic would take much longer. What would happen if we run into a third wave and we have another economic lockdown? What does it mean for our credit portfolios, for our market risk positions, and for our clients? And being able to test this out and basically to probe the horizon with highest uncertainty, I think that is very helpful. And that's the second point, what I mean by being prepared. And the third, I think, is just a soft point, but the wave of COVID-19 in Q1 hit the world so hard. I think it was absolutely important to have the right people in the right place. People who are able to stay calm under pressure. They don't crack under pressure. People who have the right mindset to deal with clients, because just because markets are declining steeply, that cannot mean that you drop clients like hot potatoes and just exit businesses. You need to work proactively with your clients. You need to protect the franchise. You need to protect the capital and the reputation of the bank. And I think that's the third point, having the right people who can deal with a situation like this in the right place when it becomes really ugly around you, and when things become really hectic and you feel the need to rush, but you actually shouldn't rush. You should still make reasonable decisions in the best interest of the clients and the bank. So all in and wrapping up, 2020 was a very exceptional year, but I think it was also a year where we could learn a lot. If you look into statistics, a pandemic like this happens on average every 100 years to planet Earth. And I was now in my career in two of these very rare events. I participated and had to work and to deal with the financial crisis in 2008. And now we had this pandemic. And I think if we draw the right conclusions, and that is not restricted to banking only and the financial world, it's, I think, concerning all of society, then we might be able to go strengthened out of this crisis into 2021, 2022. My personal assessment is that COVID-19 will stay with us for a while. And in particular, as I mentioned before, the shadows on the economy will stay. I think the crisis itself probably until the second half of 2021, before the vaccine is really available and is broadly deployed in the population, or other medical aids are developed to actually help to mitigate the symptoms of that virus. And then the economic knock-on effects will probably last into 2023, would be my assumption, on some of, let's say, industry sectors which have more heavily been impacted and were more vulnerable to an economic lockdown than maybe some other sectors in the industry.
Christian, thank you very much for joining me today and for sharing your thoughts with us. I'll see you at the event.